all of the textbooks will tell you that it's important to set the investment beliefs as a foundational part of an investment governance framework. So I'm not going to argue with the textbooks, but I would say that there are many elements to getting the investment governance framework right. And investment beliefs is part of that. I reckon you can spend a lot of money on consultants to do that, and that needs to be sort of right-sized for your organisation. But what I would say is perhaps even more important, or as important as I guess aligning on a set of investment beliefs, is to be really clear about what the mission of the organisation is, and make sure that the investment governance is fit for purpose for that mission. And so that really goes to what the investment objectives are, and how is the best way to achieve that, and structure the organisation and structure the investment process to align with that mission. So I think there's a range of elements. Beliefs is part of it. Make sure you right-size that.
Yeah. Look, I'd probably prefer not to use the word beliefs. I think beliefs have got a different sort of connotation these days when we look at the world. So for me, it's about an investment philosophy. And I think the key thing, and so yes, you should. You've got to have some consistency, I believe. But you do want to make sure that investment philosophy is grounded in very sound investment principles that have been proven, hopefully, over some period of time.
I think the principle of noses in and fingers out is very, very important, and I can think of almost no example of when that is not appropriate. I mean, at times of crisis, I think it's every bit as important that directors have noses in and fingers out. Opinions are cheap and plentiful. So you just want to make sure, I think, that at times of crisis, that everyone can be aligned. Again, what is the mission? And maybe the things that you might change for an investment committee would be to increase the frequency of formal meetings, increase the number of sort of informal contacts with the team and with the committee. But I think it has to be done on the basis of fingers out. I just don't think you want to have directors in there sort of messing with things too much. Now, the one kind of maybe exception would be if there's been, and not necessarily at a time of sort of market crisis, but if there's been a significant change of senior investment personnel, then perhaps the investment chair may need to step in a little more with the team. But but generally speaking, the investment chair should be focused on replacing that particular person, as opposed to sort of messing in and getting down and dirty with management. Right.
Look, I think we follow similar but not identical models in terms of relationship between investment committees, management teams, chief investment officer, etc. I think the key thing is to make sure there's absolute clarity about roles and responsibilities, board, investment committee, investment management group, and then within the investment management group, and in particular investment delegations. In other words, the decisions that any individual or group of individuals going all the way back up the chain is able to make. I mean, it's critical to have those really well laid out. I think those should vary depending on the board you've got, frankly, the experience and quality of the investment committee you've got, and similarly with the investment management team itself. And I think the more experienced team, you can give them broader accountability and responsibility, but if it's a newer team, probably a bit less so. But my view is that those policies should be established to not only be useful in good times, but critically to be used in bad times. And so I think it's a bit of a concern if a group, whether it's an investment committee or a board, is wanting to take a more active role in investment management just because things are not there's a bit of a crisis, there might be some market fluctuations or whatever. So that's a bit of a flag to me. You should be just sticking with the policies and procedures that you've got in place. The one thing, though, that you must do, I believe, is to increase the level of communication. Okay, so the communication that happens between the investment management team, CIO, and the chair of the investment committee must increase. The level of communication between the investment management team and the investment committee must increase, and ditto between the investment committee ultimately and the board. So you must increase, the communication must go up a lot, right, to make sure that everybody's in the loop, everybody's got the chance to, ask questions, make points, but you hopefully will stick to your agreed policies and procedures.
It's a statement of fact in all walks of life, in anything, that the more objectives you have for a particular activity, the less likely you are to achieve all of those objectives. It's always all about trade-offs. And in the investment world and in the super world, we have a lot of things coming at us. We have CPI objectives, your future, your super, peer relatives, all of that. That's a lot, and then carbon targets, a lot of stuff. That's a lot of stuff to try to, tick all of those boxes. So what I think is really important is that everybody involved, the investment team and the committee, can really align on, what the objectives, what are the important objectives of the strategy, and what's the strategy, understanding the strategy, and then executing that. So I'll give you an example of a fantastic initiative that we did at Spirit Super, and that was that we actually did a survey. I think it was just one of those Survey Monkey surveys, so not expensive to do. List of questions, what's the most important, and we surveyed both the investment team and the committee, as I said. And what was fantastic to know was that everyone was really focused on the CPI plus fund objectives, and avoiding falling foul of the performance test. So that was really very, very clear. So great alignment there. What was also very interesting was that there was a difference between the investment team and the investment committee members on the importance of peer relative and also on time frame. So the investment team were more focused on peer relative and had a slightly shorter time frame than the investment committee. But I think the key outcome was that everyone was aligned that the important thing is the CPI plus, because that's essentially that's the probability of meeting member outcomes tests.
Look, it's a fair question, and in some ways I think it has become more difficult. But ironically, one of the changes that came in with Your Future, Your Super has actually, I think, made it simpler, and I'll get to that in a second. So, look, the key thing is to ensure that for every individual investment option, there is clarity as to what the investment objective is. Okay. Today, we have to make sure that those investment objectives are taking account of the performance test associated with, Your Future, Your Super, and I think therein lies one of the interesting conundrums, or not conundrums, but one of the interesting outcomes of the recent legislation is that we do have the obligation to act in the best financial interests of our members. Now, prior to that, it was a broader obligation. The trustees therefore had, I think, a bit more latitude in terms of the way they can interpret it. It's much more limited today. And so because we've got best financial interests, it means that a lot of issues which, and certainly our membership base is quite vocal on a lot of what I'd call social type issues. We listen to the members, but frankly, at the end of the day, we've got to make decisions. As our trustees, our responsibility is very clear. We've got to make decisions which are in their best financial interests. So that is, if you like, a beacon, a guiding light, which I think is interestingly made the role for trustees a bit simpler.
So I actually just don't think it's that hard. I really don't think it's that complicated. You need to have independence, and you need to make sure that they're being done at the right frequency. So too frequently means that you're just paying independent valuers a lot of money unnecessarily if things aren't changing. And of course, APRA wants people to wants funds to value these things quarterly. You know, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's actually just a little too frequently. It's situation dependent. But I think it's important that there's an independent valuation done separate from management and at the appropriate frequency, which will vary depending on circumstances.
I think in the unlisted space, and obviously there's been a lot of focus recently about it, I don't necessarily want to overcomplicate it, so I'd keep it relatively simple. First and foremost, you must have independent valuations being done. And hopefully you've gone to the trouble of choosing the people who are doing the independent valuations are actually competent and have got a track record of being able to do it. So that's, if you like, step one. And hopefully the decision about those people has had sort of broad input to make sure you've got good people. And I know today we don't use the same valuer for all our unlisted or public, private market assets, so we have a couple. The second thing then is to make sure that you are what I would call sense checking it, because obviously if you've gone to the trouble of having an independent valuer, you can't then override them, all right? But what you can do is make sure that you ask them the appropriate questions, or put alternative if you thought about this sort of thing. And so I think that's when you would hope that your management team is maybe going to be asking them questions at a detailed level about why have you made that assumption rather than this assumption in terms of, would it be discount rates or rates of inflation or rental growth or whatever, so down in the weeds. But then at the higher level, once it comes up to an investment committee, I think what you're wanting to do in an investment committee is making sure you're trying to do a bit of a sense check. In other words, is the valuations that are coming up, is the change that's being recommended or recommended by the valuers, does that make sense to you? And I suppose an area where you can, where that might become relevant would be in property, because we've got both listed and unlisted property markets, and so, and we've all seen it in our careers where the listed markets are going down and the unlisted markets are happily being revalued upwards. And I was like, well, does this really make sense? So I think that's an example where you'd want to make sure that you've got to a sensible outcome you're happy with the outcome from a sense check.
I don't think there's a particular difference between investment risk governance and just overall risk governance. I mean, investment people, we do tend to think we're a little special, but in the case of governance and risk, I think it's all part of I think investment risk governance is just a subset of overall risk. And for a board, I think it's really important to set the tone at the top, as we always say, set the tone. I think for directors, be interested in it. Be interested in the conversations about risk. Be curious. And I'll give you the tip: if there is nothing coming forward about breaches, incidents, mistakes, then you've got a problem, because they are happening somewhere in the fund, but they are not being appropriately escalated. So I think they're important things for the board to think about: is, are we actually getting visibility into the team, and when things are going wrong, and do people feel comfortable in speaking up when they make a mistake? And that's absolutely critical. And then, of course, risk management frameworks and dashboards, and setting I think being clear on what the risk appetite of the fund is ahead of time. Being really clear on where the fund is prepared to take strategic risk, and where that's a no-go zone. I think it's really important.
So look, I think the thing to remember with investments is that if you're an active manager, that's what you're doing, is you're taking risk. Okay, so active management equals risk, and so we need to go up a level and say that we have to have really strict, or really defined, rather than strict, but we have to have really defined risk tolerances across all the portfolios. So it doesn't matter which, if we start off at investment options, we go within those, you're going to want to make sure that you have clarity about the explicit risk that you're looking to take in each part of that portfolio. In other words, what's the active, what's the active, the active markets, the more volatile ones, so like equities compared to cash or fixed income. What are we doing in terms of private markets versus listed markets? And we need to have all these things defined all the way down into the portfolio, and so there'll be limits, there'll be limits in terms of duration, there'll be limits in terms of exposure, all these sorts of things, and then we need to make sure that they're followed. So we do want our investment teams to take risk, right? But what we want them to do is to make sure they're taking risk in line with the agreed investment objectives of each and every option. So the critical thing in terms of risk culture, it's not whether you've got a risk-seeking or a risk, minimising culture. What you're wanting to have is an attitude that we're going to operate within the boundaries that are defined by our by each investment option, and it's going to be as bad a thing to not take risk when you should be taking risk, and vice versa. Okay, so you've got to operate within the boundaries that have been established by each of the policies.